Counter-terrorism is typically considered a means to combat terrorism, whereby hard power is utilised to target suspected terrorists through detaining and imprisoning them, sometimes indefinitely. The intent is to reduce the network of a fundamentalist organisation and thus prevent future attacks. Further, such action indicates the state is responsive to the threat of terrorism and is acting to deter those who might be considering joining such terrorist organisations. It links to our global politics course in terms of crises and responses, as it represents one type of response to terrorism. However, despite this, such a response can be a challenge to actually resolving terrorism, as will be explained further. In essence, counter-terrorism is any operational action that is taken and includes offensive measures to prevent, deter, preempt, and respond to terrorism. Such operations typically involve hard power, such as torturing, detaining, and imprisoning suspects. And depending on the organisation, terrorists can be detained indefinitely and often are not subject to trials. We have some examples here. In attempting to combat terrorism, subsequent to significant attacks against the state, Australia and Indonesia formed a counter-terrorist organisation called Detachment 88. So this was the response. This group was funded and trained by Australia, and the organisation, the Counter-Terrorism Organisation, aims to significantly shrink JI's network through methods of deterrence and preventing future attacks. Detachment 88 uses hard power because it detains, shoots, abuses and tortures suspected terrorists. There's evidence of this through work done by Amnesty International, who have expressed concerns over the torture of arrested activists, and they suggest that abuse has occurred. On the surface, it appears that Detachment 88 has been a successful response to terrorism because we've seen less attacks by JI in the region, and the leader is serving a 15-year imprisonment for his involvement in the Bali bombings. However, you could also argue that the response has been counterproductive. So why might Detachment 88 be a challenge to responding to terrorism and effectively resolving terrorism? One reason is that the operations undertaken by Detachment 88 often result in increased violence. The idea is that policies of force often encourage revenge attacks and prompt retaliation. So for every person who is detained or subject to brutality by Detachment 88, another person who might otherwise be free could now be willing to act out and use violence. In this sense, the use of force against otherwise innocent citizens ends up leading to increased violence that comes back against the state and against Detachment 88. One example of this was the attack against a training camp in Aceh. So the police became the number one enemy, as everybody knew someone who was directly or indirectly killed or arrested as a result of the actions of Detachment 88. So in this example, counter-terrorism, in fact, became a recruiting tool or led to more recruitment for terrorists, which undermined the work of Detachment 88 to begin with. This term counter-terrorism links to our course in a number of ways. It links to the utility of violence because counter-terrorism involves the use of force. So taking actions to deter terrorism and using violence to achieve a political objective. That objective being to reduce terrorist organisations or challenge them. Counter-terrorism can also be linked to sovereignty because it represents an action undertaken by a state. In this sense, we can recognise the ability of a government to exercise control over their territory and over their people through the use of a counter-terrorist force. The term can link also to security. It links to security because if we think about security in terms of military and state terms, it allows the state to defend itself, to maintain its security against all threats. And finally, we can consider this term counterterrorism in terms of the national interest, meaning stopping terrorism is in the national interest of Indonesia. Counterterrorism aims to secure Indonesia's security, and it uses counterterrorism to eliminate one threat, the terrorist threat, to the national interest and security of Indonesia.